picture. And I'm going to try to make an argument about how to see the bigger picture so that we can all try to avoid a spiral of despondency that we might very well fall into with Trump's second election. And I think the fact that he was elected again, it really reinforces the point that this is not just a epiphenomenon, but this is a pattern that is not only holding across time, but also holding across countries. That's the argument I'm going to try to smoke. It's not supposed to be this hard. Okay, so I was trying to make the case that what we're seeing are patterns and not just single elections, and that we should see this in terms of the long term and in terms of a comparative perspective, because what we're seeing are similar kinds of populist movements across countries and not just in the US. And Trump's reelection, I think we got to sort it out. Thanks. Trump's reelection really kind of underscores that point. And so my perspective is very different probably than what you'll hear from most of the folks in my department. Yeah, sure. Yeah, my perspective is very different from what you'll hear from most of the folks in my department who are election and polling specialists. My background is I grew up around Washington, D.C., spent 15 years working there in the bureaucracy, including working for a congressman on the Hill. And so my perspective is more one of someone who's actually lived in politics and worked on campaigns. And so this is more of kind of an insider perspective. So it will be a very different kind of approach than what you've heard so far. Mostly what we hear on the cable news is experts talking to other experts or reporters talking to other reporters. And it just drives me crazy because there just aren't a lot of insights there. So political scientists aren't really talking to them. And when they do talk to them, they talk about certain demographic groups, suburban women or, blue collar men that drink macchiatos on Fridays, these kinds of constituencies. And in a way that it's interesting to know who voted for whom, but it doesn't really explain why. Why did people vote the way they did? And I think that's the central thing that's missing from the discussion so far. So I'm going to try to give you the why from perspective of my own experience in politics, as well as populist theory. So we'll go through very briefly through kind of a reiteration of the conventional wisdom and why the conventional wisdom failed. We'll go through some insights that I have from my own personal experience, and then I'll spend a few minutes talking about populist theory and how it offers insights about what's happening around the world now and the longer term issues that it brings up. So the conventional approach, as you know, is to be focused on the polls and where they are in one given day, regardless of their quality, regardless of the fact that many people simply won't respond to polls, regardless of the fact that there are campaigns that are working on the ground and events that are happening that are changing people's perceptions day by day. We know that there are certain bases for both the Republican or the left and the right parties, but what we don't know is what the swing voters think. And there is a pretty large middle level of swing voters, as we saw in this last election. Lots of people voted for Democrats, certainly swung over and voted for Trump this time. So the polls are not really telling us what we need to know about why elections go the way they do. And we've seen that repeatedly. I know that people love the horse race, but we've seen with Hillary Clinton, who was given by Nate Silver, the guru of polling, 99% chance of winning. We saw that with Christy Clark, who was not supposed to win in BC and won. And so polling is just kind of like watching the stock market prices. On one given day after another, we don't know what's going to happen. Lots of people claim that they do, and that's why they're making lots of money with other people's money. But the bottom line is polling doesn't really tell us why people are voting the way they do. And it's been extremely frustrating to me because all this reporting time that is spent on speculation could be spent talking to voters. We don't have enough information on the ground with voters. And as an insider, as someone who actually worked in politics, I can tell you that the campaigns have a much better feel for what's going on than what's being discussed in the media. People who are in local politics or in state politics, they grew up in Pennsylvania. They know beyond the differences between Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, the rural areas, the Rust Belt, the college towns. They know the micro politics of each area. And so it's really frustrating to me that we're not getting that information. Because that information is absolutely important, right? We know, for example, now post hoc, everyone is going through the post hoc analysis, the Monday morning quarterbacking, and why so few people turn out for Harris as opposed to Biden. The idea that white women swung over, Latino and African American men swung over, young people didn't turn out as much. Okay, yeah, we can all acknowledge that after the fact, but still the question remains why. And none of this polling or horse race kind of prognostication tell us why. Some of it gets down to strategy. But the bigger question still looms, right? And the question for those of us who are more progressive or open-minded looms, which is this: we know this person is just a constant stream of lies and a stream of consciousness. We know that he's a convicted felon. He's anti-democratic. He's been, he was about to be convicted of that. He's clearly a grifter, selling gold sneakers as part of his campaign and Bibles, and he's a racist. So how could American voters vote for such a person? And I think the conventional wisdom tells us a lot, and it also tells us a limited amount about why. The reasons why it tells us a lot is because we can see very clearly, and even from the outset of the race, if people had talked to people who were running campaigns, if they talked to people more closely like James Carville or voters who were on the ground, they would know it's the economy stupid. That was the slogan he used under Clinton's campaign. And yet Harris paid very little attention to the economy. It's really befuddling. Biden's signature achievements, the IRA, which brought climate change and infrastructure across the country, something that Trump had promised to do. Biden's achievements on the CHIPS Act, which will promise to help to achieve, semiconductor manufacturing in the U.S. None of these things were featured by the Harris campaign. It's a very, very strange kind of strategy that she approached, and one that was highly risky, right? To focus so much on choice and expect that the overriding emphasis on gender and getting women out would be enough to overcome the challenges of incumbency. And in effect, as you know, has been repeated many times, everyone wants to vote for change, right? That's just symptomatic of the democratic system. And yet, when she was asked, "What are you going to do differently from Biden?" she couldn't answer the question. This also points to what we know as campaign insiders, which is it's not only the economy stupid, it was obviously immigration. She never mentioned anything about that. Those were obviously the two top issues. Why did she shy away from those things? The only thing I can say is that there are candidates and there are flawed candidates. There are some candidates who are naturals, and I've been around them around Capitol Hill. I actually shared an elevator with Nancy Pelosi one time. And they're just people who are naturally charismatic, and they give off an air, and like Bill Clinton whispering in some constituent's ear. They know how to get their attention and to convince them that they're on their side. And so there's a reason why Harris lost in the first primary. She doesn't have those natural gifts. She doesn't have those natural instincts. And as much as we can game it and use surveys and polls, you have to have a natural instinct for strategy to be able to be successful in any kind of campaign. And Trump had that to a certain extent, despite all of his distractions. Some other criticisms I have of the conventional wisdom and the way that experts approach these elections. No one has a single identity. It's really strange to me when they talk about suburban white women or they talk about African American males as if Obama scolding them is somehow going to change the way they think about things. Nobody is talking to these folks in terms of their reality. We know, for example, in the 2016 election from the exit polls, that many of the white suburban women happen to be married to blue collar men. And so they had divided loyalties, right? To pretend that these are individuals with intractable identities and are only going to vote Democratic or Republican, that is just foolish. You guys are too young probably to remember, but there was the same level of despondency in 1984 after Reagan was reelected, and the whole map was red other than Minnesota and DC. Those were the only two little blue oases. And then we see Clinton was elected in the 1990s. So we shouldn't feel despair, but we should recognize that, trying to create a campaign strategy on the basis of individual constituencies is not going to cut it. The second thing is that Biden had perhaps the most ambitious and successful legislative agenda since FDR. So why didn't the Democrats message that? I don't know. I simply don't have any clear ideas. Part of the problem is a timing problem, right? A lot of these infrastructure projects take years to get up and off the ground before they're shovel ready. The chips investments are just happening now. They're just starting to build the factories. The IRA and the climate change stuff, it's just starting to happen. But why weren't the Democrats at every single ribbon cutting event, right? These Republican districts, there were far more Republican districts that received this money than Democratic districts, and yet the Democrats got no credit for it. So to me, that's just bad politics. On the other hand, obviously, there were things that the Democrats couldn't control. You can't control the timing of wars, despite Trump's claim that there were no wars when I was president. Did someone tell Putin when he should invade and when he shouldn't invade? That doesn't make any sense, right? And this is a real problem for anyone running for office to say that I control the economy. There are 200 million people in the American economy. Each one of them is making an effect on decision making. All the folks in Wall Street, all the folks in China that are investing and engaging in financial trading on a day-by-day basis. All of those are decision makers that affect the economy. We know over the long term that there are economic cycles, and these cycles have very little to do with short-term decision making. The Democrats had a great economic plan for 10 or 20 years. They didn't have a great economic plan for the short term. And so there is a real problem with the way the media talks about the economy, as if Biden controls the rate of inflation. The rate of inflation was created by the pandemic. It was created by the commodity inflation because of the invasion of Ukraine, which affected food prices and also affected oil prices. This has nothing to do with presidential decision making. So this is a huge problem for any candidate that's in office. You're either lucky, like Trump was lucky in the post-2008 recovery, or you're unlucky, like Biden was unlucky in the post-pandemic recovery. And now, ironically, Trump is going to benefit from the improvement in the cycle, most likely, right? Although he's trying as hard as he can to screw the economy up again with all this tariff war. So we'll see. And certainly it doesn't bode well for Canada. So those things are just kind of luck, but it doesn't excuse the lack of messaging. The realignment of the Democratic Party towards, Harris inviting in, the most conservative elements, Liz Cheney onto the campaign stage. That shows that they really don't know what they're doing. Like, Liz Cheney is not going to swing votes in Democratic districts, and she's not going to swing Republican votes. There's a reason why Nikki Haley didn't succeed in the primary and didn't really get anywhere. There's supposedly Nikki Haley voters out there, and it's the same problem that we just talked about. To just focus on the constituency and not think about the messaging or think about the real life situation of the voters is a huge problem. Bringing Liz Cheney on the stage and saying, we're going to save democracy, it's not speaking to the voters' number one and number two issues. Well, number one issue is the economy. So how does that help the messaging? It really is a bad strategy. In any case, we would have to really understand the election. We would really have to look at it state by state and almost district by district. And what you're going to see is these large kind of discussions about suburban voters or Black males or Latino voters. They're really misplaced because on a state by state basis, you're going to see that the location and the specific situation and the specific local politics have much more to do with how people vote than what, demographic group they're part of. So this is my problem with the conventional wisdom. Ultimately, what we saw was a rejection of the status quo. And so that brings me to the long-term perspective in the book I wrote in 2016. And what I saw, I really wanted to understand how Trump, this really strange and crazy kind of character, could get elected. A complete break with Republican parties, basically broken the Republican Party. Changes his mind from one minute to the next on, stuff like abortion, on economic trade. All of a sudden, NAFTA is the worst agreement. He makes a few little changes, and now it's the best agreement. There's no policy substance to Trump there. So what is he tapping into? And when I started to look more and more into the issue, what I saw was that there are underlying forces, and these help to explain other phenomena that are happening in terms of the rise of the right wing. Le Pen was starting to make her appearance in politics there as a daughter of a far right wing and really isolated leader. And they, as you know, they've made gains. Uh, the right wing in Germany has made gains recently. Orban has been in Hungary for some time. We've had all these dictators in the developing world, like Duterte in the Philippines, Bolsonaro in Brazil, who's now being indicted for his January 6th similar kind of effort. So it's not just what's happening in the US. There's something way bigger that's happening that we're missing and that no one in the media is really talking about. And I think political scientists aren't paying enough attention to. And what we see is there is an anti-incumbent fever that's happening, not only in this election, but in many recent elections, where the right wing in some countries like Brazil, like India with the Modi rejection, semi-rejection, Botswana, Japan, the LDP that's been in power for over 50 years, Sri Lanka, South Korea, even France, Macron has a very kind of fledgling coalition that's barely hanging on, right? But it's only also happening on the left. I'm anticipating that I don't think it's takes a lot of prognostication or polls to anticipate that Trudeau has been losing support all over the place, and that there's likely, and we saw the Conservatives made gains in BC. The South African Revolutionary Party has lost power. So this is happening all over the place. There is just a rejection of the status quo in terms of politics. We have a Trump-like figure now that's been elected in Argentina, and they're probably going to be the first country to pull out of the Paris Agreement. So there's some really strange stuff that's happening all around the world now. And I think that populist theory helps us to understand this better. So here's the deal, Jack. It's very simple. No joking, seriously. Uh, it's very simple to understand. Basically, populist theory tells us that there is a crisis in established politics. The status quo is not appearing to respond to voters' needs, and they're spreading feelings of marginalization. And these spreading feelings allow a populist leader to step into that vacuum. And the Democratic Party has been struggling for years with its identity. It used to be a blue-collar party, and then Clinton came into power, signed the NAFTA, and basically blew thousands of jobs down into Mexico. So they were no longer the blue-collar party. And the Republicans somehow have found a way to take advantage of that. These are marginalized constituencies that feel like the current status quo isn't willing to support them. That's why, even though Biden was on the picket lines, unions weren't willing to support him, right? He had the leaders' endorsements of some of the main unions, but the rank and file were unwilling to endorse him because they've lost touch with their constituencies. So are they Democrats or the Republicans? Right now, that's in play, right? Right now, they're Republicans, but they could easily switch. So this crisis in the status quo, this feeling of alienation, to the point where a comedian that was the Beppe Grillo was elected in Italy. These are very strange things that are happening where outsiders are able to come in and say, I can fix all your problems because I'm a non-politician. I'm a successful business person, even though obviously we know over history, people who know how to run businesses like Elon Musk don't know how to run a government, and that will be proven again. But because they're outsiders and they're not part of the system, they're so attractive. People want easy solutions, especially in our hyper reality situation of social media now. People want 30-second solutions. They don't want 10 and 20-year solutions. And social media, therefore, really whips up and reinforces all the disinformation that feeds into these populist movements. And we know what these leaders are against. We know that Trump is against the China. He's against the deep state. He's against Washington insiders and draining the swamp. We know all these stuff that he's against. What is he really for? We know he's going to increase tariffs, but what is that going to lead to? There is no vision whatsoever about what the country should look like in 4 or 5 years, other than that he should have power and everyone around it that should bend the knee to him. That's the populist playbook. And so you wonder, how do people follow this, right? How do people elect Boris Johnson? Because of the funny way he put his hair? No, it was because of disgust with ordinary politics and the lack of an alternative that's being offered if you say Jeremy Corbyn is our alternative, it's not really a viable alternative. So there's a lack of viable alternatives being offered by our conventional political parties. So what's going to happen? Well, the playbook is really easy to read, which is that the leader wins power, and they're in this paradoxical position where they need to use the government to carry out their program. So they're anti-government, but then they have to rely on the government. And so all their fallback is always, well, it's the state that didn't allow me to clean the house. So it's an inherent contradiction. And sooner or later, what we see is when the tariff war ramps up, and we have the biggest debt in history, and the Republicans say, well, we're not going to actually agree with Matt Gaetz as our attorney general, especially if he's been engaged in sex with minors. What we see is that all these promises, like the Wizard of Oz, will just start to fall apart. It didn't happen the first time, but it will happen again, as Trump screws up the economy. And this has happened over and over again. We know in Poland now, they have a new government. A populist leader was pushed out because of lack of results. So the biggest challenge is if the new populist leaders can start to take over and tinker with the machinery of government itself. And we've seen that Trump's already done that with the Supreme Court. And if he gets Elon Musk in there and starts cutting stuff like the EPA, and we have the worldwide wrestling wife who's in charge of the Department of Education, this stuff will take a long time to undo the damage that they do to the government machinery. We know that they're going to fail, but how much damage are they going to create in the meantime? And they can keep blaming the deep state, but voters sooner or later are going to lose their patience with all these phony excuses. The only thing that the populist leader can hope for is an upswing in the economy, and Trump may benefit from that, but he's probably going to mess it up with all his tariff wars. So we know that the populist fever will break at some point, and the real results of a lack of a substantive program will start to show themselves. But we have much longer term problems than just this populist fever. And these extend way beyond the US to Canada and every Western country, and they're starting to affect China as well. These go back at least to the 2000 dot-com bubble. Right, there was this rise of conservative media, Fox News, and now all of these right-wing podcasts that are constantly spreading misinformation. And as these financial crises happen, it's super easy to use these crises, these financial crises and economic crises, to scapegoat. And that, in my opinion, is where this anti-immigration and xenophobic fever, not only in the US, but in the EU, is coming from. Who's to blame? We can't just say, hey, there's something wrong with the economic structure, which is the argument I'm going to give you. That doesn't play very well in a 30-second media or TikTok clip. But blame immigrants for losing your jobs. That's a really easy message to send and harder to refute, especially when Biden hasn't really done much about the border. My brother works on immigration. He says the problem could be solved, within 60 days, simply by hiring more judges to process the amnesty claims and the asylum claims more quickly. But the Democratic left has kind of refused to go along with that. The Republicans have blocked it just for the sake of blocking it. So it's so easy to end up with these, kind of scapegoating issues. But in the end, the scapegoating is not going to solve these problems, because what we have are much bigger issues in terms of our economic problems. After 2001, we spent trillions of dollars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Imagine if that money had been invested in our economies. We have nothing to show for that money. What we have is just incredible instability across the region. And now Israel is ramping up more and more instability again. And how long is it going to take to sort out those issues? 2008 financial crisis. This was a really crucial point, a crucial historical conjuncture, because what happened? Obama stepped in. Following on Bush, there was continuity there to bail out Wall Street. And when he bailed out Wall Street, only one person of a small regional bank in New York ever went to jail. No one was held responsible for these shoddy bets they made, outright fraud and misinformation. Nobody was held responsible. In fact, the banks were bailed out. And then what they've done is complain about the regulations that were put on to try to avoid a second crisis. So I have a book about this. We could spend more time talking about it. But essentially, the message to the population was, hey, you might have lost your home because of all these bad mortgage deals and all the speculation that was involved in real estate. But we're not going to bail you out. We're only going to bail out the banks that actually made those bad loans. So that message really kind of pushed the Tea Party forward. And it also pushed a kind of slowly bubbling anger that's going right through the population about the loss of economic opportunity. Then you add a pandemic on top of that. And as you know, that pretty much brought the economy to a standstill, also created huge debts for Western governments so that they have much less room to intervene in the economy. But one ironic thing that came out of the pandemic was we know that when governments invest in supporting populations in their dire needs to support basic material health, poverty went down significantly in the US. So it's really interesting to me, why haven't the Democrats talked about this? They're so afraid to talk about the value of government because of the labels that have been won, going back to the 1980s in Reagan, that government isn't the solution to the problem, it is the source of the problem. This anti-government fervor actually puts people in a bind because we know when government intervenes, it can reduce poverty, it can solve some of these issues. But because it has such a bad reputation, Democrats and liberals around the world are afraid to intervene in the economy at this point. And the housing crisis is an example of that. We know I don't have exact figures or data, but we know, for example, in more recent years, and especially in the last 5 to 10 years, that there is incredible speculation in real estate. This is not just a housing market that is run by the middle class. Huge millions of dollars that are coming offshore, fleeing from China and other economies, and being put into either directly into housing or into financial houses that are then buying up houses. So now housing is viewed as a way for investment firms to diversify, and therefore it's clear that the housing shortage, that's not the only source of the housing shortage, but that's one of the biggest sources of the housing shortage, is that people who are involved in the real estate market and banks are making tons of money on it. But in the meantime, by using it as an investment vehicle, they're squeezing out middle class ability to buy houses. So what we see is a loss of information and clear analysis about the sources of this discontent. Not enough people are really digging into the roots of the economic dislocations that have been occurring for decades. And I'll tell you from living in Washington that most of my time working for a congressman was not spent with constituents, it was spent with lobbyists. So almost all of our events were around oysters, Rockefeller, and Chardonnays, and talking about how the person I worked for, who was on the House Armed Services Committee, could help them to get their procurement or fund their military base. Average cost of a House race is 1.8 million. Average cost of Senate race, 10.8 million. So this is a rich person's game. And the only way you can win, if you have 95% incumbency reelection, the only way you can win is by linking yourself up with industry groups and with lobbyists. It's the only way you have a chance. Unless someone like Matt Gaetz engages in a sex scandal, then you have a chance. But otherwise, it's super hard to dislodge anyone. So we have a crisis in our democracy as well in terms of incumbency. We know if we add to that gerrymandering, and we add to that the fact that there is a control by these congresspeople in terms of the media, and that it's super hard for anyone to challenge and to actually make change. So this is what I'm wondering. Why isn't anyone in the media tracing back? Where do people get their money for their campaign? Everyone was so happy that Harris raised $1 billion. $1 billion is just an incredible amount to spend on media campaigns. Where did that money go? Right? Where was the platform for middle-class people? Where was a platform for telling African American males for the first time, we're going to actually do something concrete to change your lives? It was all spent on advertising and messaging. It wasn't spent on concrete things. And that's the reason why people think that people in Ottawa or people in Washington are out of touch with their everyday reality, because they are out of touch. They mostly come from very wealthy classes. They spend most of their time raising money from lobbyists. and they don't spend a whole lot of time talking to ordinary constituents or thinking about their problems. So I think Trump has really hit on something that's important, which is that people do believe that there's a swamp there and that the system is rigged. And it's not inaccurate to say that. So, a summary of my argument is that populism is arising from the failure of established institutions to solve the problems of the working class. And it's activated by a leader who exploits that sense of crisis. What I'm going to argue next, and I'll show you some data on this is not a purely xenophobic or racist reaction. I know that a lot of my colleagues have take issue with this, and we can have a longer discussion about that. Most of the people in the U.S. are for immigration, but they're against illegal immigration. I don't think it's an unreasonable stance. And if Trump starts to round up millions of people, the food supply chains and the construction supply chains and all the maintenance and cleaning jobs, all of that stuff's going to be in crisis. So we have to rely on immigration. There's no way to stop immigration. I'll show you why even more. I'll reinforce that point in a few minutes. But the problem is the perception that people are cheating the system. So you say, why did Latinos vote against Harris? It's because they've been here for a generation or two. And they say, I went in the legal way. I spent years going through the legal process. Why should we have an open and porous border when these people are competing for the same jobs that I'm competing for? So explains why immigrants are also anti, open borders. It makes perfect sense. So the longer term argument I'm going to make is that there are changes underlying the Western economic structure that help to explain this problem. So these are just some graphs. I have a lot more in the book that you can check out. So these are just percentage of whites who approve of interracial intermarriage in the US. And you can see there is a long-term arc, right? It would be unthinkable when I was growing up to think that an African American could be president. Like, you would have been laughed out of the room if you suggested that. And to think that, a white, a mixed race woman who could be a viable candidate, that would have been unthinkable. So I think we shouldn't rush to judgment and just write this off as all people are racist. I'm not saying there aren't racists, and there are clearly, we saw in Charlottesville, people that are, kind of Looney Tunes in terms of racial attitudes that are part of the Trump umbrella. He's, allowing them to, and giving them license to engage in such behavior. But I think it's a pretty small percentage of the population. And you can see that I think one of his cabinet picks is going to be the first gay, I can't remember which ministry it is. He has a woman as his chief of staff. He plays on the xenophobic and racist angle, but I don't think we're going to go back to where it was in the 1960s or 1950s. The arc of progress is always slow and meandering, but we're not going backwards, in my opinion. Percentage of whites who believe in legal intervention to prevent racial discrimination in housing sales. Most of them believe that there should be intervention. So we can go across the board and look at conditions between the 1960s or 1970s and now, and it's a completely different kind of situation, even though it feels like we're going backwards. This is a graph about the number of immigrants in the U.S. and where people think it should be. And most people think it should remain as it is. So again, the problem is not that people are just incredibly xenophobic. It's that they're against this idea of illegal immigration and a kind of a lawlessness at the border where it's uncontrolled. So, Nikki Haley was a viable candidate. Minority voters increasingly are not voting purely on racial lines, even though choice was supposedly, Harris's signature measure. In most states, it was actually supported by the voters. So they rejected Harris, but they supported choice. So my own opinion is this is really kind of a form of short-term scapegoating. And in the end of the day, all the figures tell us that immigrants, even illegal immigrants, don't engage in crime. They engage in crime at lower rates. They don't take jobs. They mostly take jobs that other people don't want. Even if Trump cracks down on the border, it's not going to change the fundamental problems that we face. There is a problem in terms of the less reputation, I would say, with some in the middle, which is that We know that social change happens, and we know that it's inevitable that we are becoming a more progressive society, I would say. But they've allowed themselves to be labeled with kind of more extremist kind of labels, as if, you know, having trans athletes in sports is a big issue. Instead of arguing this point, they just let it go. And so that label sticks that they are somehow radical. Instead of arguing the points about illegal immigration not really affecting the economy, they say, "Oh yeah, we're going to really cut down on the immigration as well." So the left doesn't really have a clear message about where it stands. Nobody is standing up for progressive values. Bernie Sanders, to me, would have been a much better candidate than Hillary Clinton because everyone knew what he stood for. And in a populist moment, authenticity is the most important value. Harris had no authenticity. We didn't know what she thought from one moment to the next. She changed her positions radically. Hillary Clinton, she just seemed like someone who wanted to be president and happened to be, the wife of someone. She had great qualifications, but she was not a natural candidate. And so when people answer questions to the media and they seem inauthentic, then that label is really going to stick. And the ability for people to attack you and put stereotypes on you is much greater. So let's talk about the economy now. So Standard and Poor's, Trump was so happy the stock market was up when he was president. What's up even higher? So the stock market seems to be great. Some people are obviously making money. Working class, I have to try to remind some of my in-laws sometimes, working class generally doesn't own a lot of stocks. So, Trump's really not helping you out that much if you're thinking about stocks. Let's look at long-term economic growth. The long-term economic growth in the West has been on a steady decline. This is up to 2014 in his first election. India and China are the ones that are the winners in the world economy right now. So this is not just some perception. The economy in the West has been on the fritters for a long time. If you think about this great generation that came after World War II, education levels went up, income levels went up. We went through this incredible boom time after World War II, and we thought it's just going to keep continuing. Every generation is going to have a better standard of living. But we're at the point now where this generation may be facing the point where your standard of living is either going to plateau or it may go down, especially on the basis of climate change. That's a really hard thing for a politician to sell. You have to do with less. Good luck getting elected on that message. And Trump is not off base. People in the Rust Belt are super angry with China. And he's not off base because China has stolen intellectual property. It's forced companies that enter into its space, including Tesla, to play by its rules, and it's taken their intellectual property and then it competes with them. And it's run up, along with Germany, a very steady trade surplus. A trade surplus should go up and down based on your economy, but when you have a surplus that persists over years, that means that someone's gaming the economy. And this is why I'm really concerned about the state of global affairs, because if this war between the US and China heats up, the whole global economy could really be in trouble. But it's on a sound basis. It's that based on the fact that China's been gaming the world economy. It's been running up a deficit. It's been artificially lowering the value of its currency. And it's been basically stealing intellectual property. And it's not willing to compete on a fair playing field. And those things were forgivable in the 1990s. But when you think about the fact that right now they have control 90% of the battery technology and they have most of the EVs and their EVs are technologically superior and cheaper, this is big trouble for the West. And that's why the West is not able to stand for it anymore, because they're just seeing jobs and jobs just continue to sieve out to China. And you can see that here, this is the manufacturing as a percentage of the economy. You can see the slow decline over time of manufacturing in the US. And I can show you the graphs for every Western country that will show you the same thing. Look at the UK. This is manufacturing that slowly goes down. So this is what is happening, right? The working class was basically the whole Western dream, the American dream was based on social mobility and income mobility. And if you're a college educated person, new economy is not that bad. But if you're a high school educated person or a blue collar person, the new economy is awful for you, right? You have no ladders to move up to the middle class. And you combine that with the cost of housing and everything else increasing, the middle class is shrinking. And I'll show you more about that momentarily. Here's China. So you can see how small the manufacturing sector was over time. and increasing over time, and now competing in tech services and competing in a wide variety of sectors. At first, we thought they're just going to take blue collar jobs and produce cheap stuff, kind of like what we thought about Japan after World War II. And then the Japanese and the Koreans grew up, and now the Chinese have grown up, and they can compete with us on an even playing field. So here's a percentage of employment in manufacturing. You can see, again, the steady decline, including in some of the East Asian countries. Japan's been in the doldrums for 2 decades. It's not a coincidence. That's exactly when China comes on the scene, right? Korea's got huge problems. They just had a change election as well. It's because they can't compete with China. So something's got to give here. And just to reinforce this point, let's look at, these were the main companies in 1917. You can see in the US, most of these are mining, steel, agriculture, rubber, providing solid blue collar jobs, right? All production kind of oriented ones. Here you start to see a decline. There's more focus on oil and gas and some telecom and cosmetics. And here's where we are now. We have the largest firms in the world are tech firms. Tech firms don't employ a whole lot of people. And the people they do employ are college educated or super bright programmers. There's not a lot of manufacturing that's happening in the West now. Apple's producing its iPhone in China, right? So all this manufacturing is occurring overseas, while the profits are still accruing to the tech companies. So the stock market is doing great, but who is enjoying the fruits of that profit? It's a handful of people, a much more limited percentage of the population, because the economy, the nature of the economy and what we produce has changed. Financial services, same thing, right? These guys are making so much money. They're living great lives, but they're not employing a whole lot of people, right? How many people are financial analysts? And so it's the financialization of the economy. At one time, GM and the CEO of GM said, as GM goes, the US goes. That's no longer true, because GM cannot operate without Wall Street. Wall Street is the one that actually calls the shots. And we saw that in 2008. And after they were bailed out, these auto companies cannot do anything. No companies can do anything without financial support from Wall Street. And on top of that, what we have is an incredible layer of financial speculation. So, we have mortgages that are being traded around like pieces of pie, as they say, secondary markets, futures markets. This has nothing to do with whether that person has a sound credit rating. This has to do with financial speculation. And so we see that the financial basis of the economy is very, very fragile because of this incredible speculation that's happening on markets, on offshore finance markets. You know that the largest companies don't pay any taxes, right? Because their headquarters are in the Bahamas or in Ireland or somewhere offshore. Nobody can track this money. The same money that was funding bin Laden or narco terrorists, it's in these offshore banks. It's the same place where the companies have their offshore accounts and where millions of dollars of Chinese money is fleeing. So we have what we call shell corporations. When I was working for the U.S. International Trade Commission, they said, can you just do a report tracing FDI, foreign direct investment? And I traced FDI back to the Bahamas, and I can't tell who owns it, because you have a shell corporation. It's like all this real estate around here. Who owns this? It's traced to a shell corporation. Nobody knows, because the Bahamas doesn't require the shell corporation to say who the owner is. So we have this parallel financial system that's happening based purely on speculation and tax evasion that is undermining the real economy where workers live. So U.S. corporate profit, it's doing great, right? The companies are doing great, but the workers are not doing great. Here's the real wages over time from 1960. So this is counting for inflation. What you see is a flat line. There's a slight increase here, right in the late 2010s, but it's basically a flat line. So it's no wonder workers are mad, right? Look at this spike in the corporate profit and compare it to real wages. Of course, people are angry, right? We have this Western dream that everyone's going to do better and everyone's going to have an easy life. It's not happening anymore. There are much greater obstacles happening. This reinforces the point. The red asterisk is those who have a high school or less education, and those who have higher education, university, 5 years or more. You can see this incredible spike here. Meanwhile, those who have a high school education or less, they're doing actually worse than they were earlier. So the working class is doing way worse in the West than it was relative to the 1960s. This is why people are angry and why they're open to populists, because nobody's actually addressing their concerns. The populists aren't either, but they pretend to be. But the mainstream parties are not addressing them. So this is Piketty's U curve. And so Piketty is a French economist, and he looked at income tax records in Western countries over a century and who was paying the taxes. And from those income tax records, he could trace them to households and figure out, who has what percentage of the wealth or income in society, not the wealth. So what you see is this U-shaped curve, inequality, right? This is the 1920s and 1930s with the Great Depression. What happens then, right? The economy was in complete crisis, somewhat similar to where we are, not as acute, but think about 2008, think about the pandemic. And what happens? They introduce all kinds of social welfare programs, right? And this is where industrialization takes off. This is the middle class sweet spot right here. But if we go back earlier in history, income inequality was never that low. Like it's almost like the World War II period was actually an exception. We thought it was the rule, but it actually looks like it was an exception. And so we're back up here now. Income inequality got worse over time. That's the U-shaped curve. And you see it across almost every Western country. The continental European countries, they tend to be less acute, like France is less acute. And the reason is obvious. Anyone know what that reason is? I'm sure you know.
Bigger state, more welfare,
Yeah.
pensions.
Yeah, they have a bigger safety net, right? So that's exactly why it went down here and why it's gone up, because of deregulation and the rise of the neoliberal economy, the focus on market economies and less focus on the workers. Everyone thought, well, we'll just let them unleash the market. Well, the market did great on efficiency, didn't do great on distribution or creating jobs. And we know this is occurring around the world. I'm sure you've seen the statistics. 10% of the world's wealthy take home 52% of its income, 10%, and the bottom half takes home 8.5%. We can go through every country and go through the same statistics. So this is the UK. I didn't have complete data on this. You can see it went down nicely until the late labor years, and then it spikes with Thatcher again with neoliberalism. So that's where we are, right? But unfortunately, the state has a bad name and has a bad reputation. The new UK government can announce that we're going to create a new welfare state. That just wouldn't go over because voters have been inundated with this idea that the market is the only solution. And so we have the other bigger problem we have besides economic structure is a demographic problem. And this is why I think this whole thing about xenophobia is going to fail, because we know we have a rapidly aging population. In Russia, it's actually almost a negative birth rate. And in parts of Europe, it's also negative, right? They're losing their population because of the birth rate declines. So you can see the US, we had lots of ready workers in the 1950s, middle-aged workers. And now we're going to have these huge pension problems right around the corner as the population ages. And the same is true across the West. So how can you solve these problems? How can you fill these lower working class jobs when you don't have a middle-aged population? The only way is through immigration. So at some point, white folks in Europe and Canada are just going to have to accept that we're in the US are going to have to accept that the only way to support our economies is going to allow for more immigration. It just has to be legal. It's interesting to note also that China is going through a similar demographic decline, albeit at a slower pace. And so if the countries in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia are clever, they could probably have an opportunity to take some of these jobs because they'll have the lowest wage rates. So far, they haven't been organized enough to do that. I don't know if you saw this story just last week. Someone duct taped a banana that they bought for 35 cents in Manhattan to a wall, and it was sold in Sotheby's as a work of art for $6.2 million by a crypto millionaire. So this is the kind of wealth inequality we're talking about, like back to the 1920s. This is why people are angry. Unfortunately, people, and they're going to be angry about this around the globe, people are speaking with their feet through migration. I think that, we shouldn't be too hasty to think that Trump's going to be a total disaster. I think this trade war with China is inevitable, and it's just continuing the same policies as Biden had. I think that by luck, purely by luck, Israel obviously reached a ceasefire with Hezbollah. There's some exhaustion on their part, and Trump will, of course, take credit. Ukraine is also exhausted. I think there's a possibility that those conflicts could wind down. Nothing to do with Trump. I think it's just luck of timing. I don't think that he's going to peel back too much on climate change because, as I mentioned at the outset, the Republican districts are receiving so much money. They were so much against, they are all climate change deniers. And, they lashed Biden left and right. But when the money came to their districts, they didn't say no. They're not going to say no. And the same for the CHIPS Act. So some Biden's agenda will continue. And even at the subnational level, for example, California has EV mandates. They're not going to roll those back. The federal government can't force people to roll back EV mandates. So I don't think it's going to be a complete disaster on climate, but there certainly will be a step back. There's also convergence around a crackdown on big tech. We'll see if they actually break up some of these monopolies. And no one is willing to touch healthcare. So as much as Trump claimed, and they tried, I don't remember, 60 sometimes to defeat the ACA, Obamacare, they never did it because once people get welfare benefits, they don't want to give them up. And that's what the Democratic Party is missing. You have this incredibly fluid structure of tech billionaires and AI, which is going to make even more and more people redundant. And then you have people at the bottom who've lost their blue collar jobs. Something's got to give there. And the only solution is to create some kind of a safety net, in my opinion. So these are the things that we talked about. We're in a populist moment because of the change, in my opinion, of the economic structure of Western economies and the decline of manufacturing and the ability for social mobility, as well as the financialization of the economy. There is a real anger at the loss of living standards and the possibilities of improving or maintaining your living standards. But I think it's inevitable for the demographic reasons I just showed you, among others, to say that we're moving towards a post-racial society. We're moving towards a post-gender society, and potentially we're moving in the very long run towards a post-national society, of which Canada is a good example. I don't think there's any way to stop those things because of the demographic trends that I just showed you. So what happens, right, when this aging population starts to accept more immigrants in Europe from the Middle East? It could take generations before those populations integrate, but integrate they will. And so the real challenge is more about making sure that Western values are preserved rather than maintaining kind of racial lines. That's an impossible thing to pull off. And I think it is starting to happen, right? You have completely different vibe in Vancouver, for example, than you would in the middle of Saskatchewan, right? Where you have less population inflow. And so you'll see that change. You see that change happening in places like San Francisco and New York. Completely different kind of post-national and post-racial feel than what you have in what they call flyover country in the middle of the states. But it'll still happen there too, right? Sooner or later, those are the fastest aging populations in places like Iowa or Minnesota. And so immigration is undergirding their economies. Like the whole, whatever's left of manufacturing would just disappear out of the Midwest. Agriculture would disappear without immigration. So sooner or later, people are going to have to accept it. There's just no way. I think the problem that I would point out is that in terms of the Democratic messaging is there's no problem with asking people to be tolerant and to consider differences. But when it's done in a shaming way, that's what creates a backlash. To tell white people, maybe some of you will disagree with me, in Texas that everything you learned was a lie when you grew up and that you were raised in a post-colonial state and you should be embarrassed and ashamed of your race. It's probably not something that people that grew up in the 1960s are going to accept. At least they're not going to accept it like that. To me, it would be better messaging to say, look at all the benefits of a post-racial society. Look at all the benefits of a post-gender society. Look at all these incredible leaders and contributions that we have from folks that have different backgrounds. Like celebrating diversity as a positive message would be so much easier to sell than trying to shame people and make them feel bad about things that they didn't directly have a hand in, but probably benefit from. But that's just a strategy point. So all of these things are going to accelerate, and the question is, what are we going to do about it? And to me, the only answer is to extend the welfare state. It's because I don't see any way manufacturing is going to come back, no matter what Trump says. It's not going to come back to the UK. It's not going to come back to Europe. So how are we going to support these populations that aren't programmers, that aren't financial wizards? The only way is for them to either pay universal basic income or support parts of the population as they transition to more of a services-oriented economy. Polanyi is he's the most famous theory about the welfare state. Karl Polanyi is his name. He wrote a book in the late 1900s called The Great Transformation. And he said the reason why Marx's revolution will never happen, would not happen, is because the West will start to realize that an economy as a free market is embedded in society. And ultimately, society decides what that market looks like. And so Polanyi actually presaged the welfare state like 40 years before it actually happened. And so he said there will be a natural correction by society because, remember in Marxism, we had kids that were working, we had no worker safety, the stuff that you see in Bangladesh and parts of the global South now. There was no kind of basic standards or for working conditions or for kids working or required education, all of those things that we take for granted. And what he said was the conditions are so bad that there'll be a backlash from society and the society will have to step in and create rules around the market. And I believe we're in that Polanyi type moment now. I hope I'm right, but I guess only time will tell. So those are my thoughts. I'm really happy to hear yours and happy to go back to any kind of slides or observations. Yeah, go ahead, Daphne.
Let's say a little bit repeated. Let's say is particularly charismatic. I don't think that is on but so a couple of things I want to touch on. So you discussed a little bit the racial dimension of the election in regards to Harris, but I wonder what's your take on sexism? Because I do think, and maybe this is like at this point like intuitive more than anything else, but I do think like some insidious, that some widespread sexism kind of works quite insidiously in the sense that you don't. It's more like it's not outright, but it's like this lack of trust that a woman is any person with serious enough to.
So the first part of your comment, I understand what you're saying. Nancy Pelosi, especially on CNN, is not particularly charismatic, but there's a retail politics. And when you see a politician in a room and the way they talk to people and move around with people, and Clinton's "I feel your pain," she's got that. And you just never get the sense that there is that same level of connection with other people. It's just a natural talent. I don't think it's something that someone can learn. And I'm telling you, like just watching her walk around Capitol Hill, man, just the way she was the most effective, leader of Congress, probably in a generation, perhaps historically, as a woman leader. And it's because people were willing to listen to what she had to say. She had so much influence. So I would say, despite the way that she comes across on media, she has an incredible talent. And that's a natural talent. It's not something that you can learn in a political science class. In terms of the second question, I'm sure you're right? There's definitely reservations about women candidates, but I would point to not only Nancy Pelosi, but also Gretchen Whitmer. There are other examples of strong women leaders, but certainly you're right that they have to overcome an additional bias. There's no question about that. Yeah, Shivaji.
So yeah, thanks. This is fascinating, especially the part about the manufacturing sector shrinking historically over time, and that. So in a way, it's kind of contradictory. I had two questions. The first one is, it seems like Karl Marx would have said that this is an ideal time for someone to vote for a leftist party in the United States. The workers are suffering and the working sector is shrinking. Historically, blue collar jobs are going up and you have these financial sector jobs and these rich people going up.
Right.
So in this situation, why would people vote for a right-wing populist? Why not for a left-wing populist? Is it just a random chance that we don't have someone like Bernie Sanders? Because logically, someone like Bernie Sanders or anyone who's left-wing or part of the left-wing in the Democratic Party
That's-
should logically have one. So it's nothing to do with a right wing or left wing. It's just with populism. And that's kind of my first question.
Yeah, so Claire, feel free to, or Troy, feel free to weigh in, but I think that there is because of the money pressure on the Democratic Party and the amount of money they have to raise and their ties to industry, that kind of chokes off the possibility, at least in the US, for a genuine leftist candidate to win. And you saw that the Democratic Party sabotaged Bernie Sanders' candidacy in 2016. He was as popular, probably more popular than Trump, and he was certainly filling stadiums bigger than Hillary Clinton. So the established parties and Democratic Party is established conservative party are not willing to see the writing on the wall and say we need to actually open things up for a radical turn because they're bought and paid for by vested interests. And so that's why the populist event has to happen before you can actually have an uprising from the grassroots that will open the way. There has to be a big enough defeat for the establishment for a genuine reform to come in. And I would say on top of that, the left has not really put forward a cogent agenda. What we know that Bernie Sanders had a clear agenda, which was, universal health care, but the rest of his agenda was pretty sketchy. And so the left has been, I don't know, resting on 1960s ideas or 1970s ideas. The left has not presented a clear agenda about what its vision is for restoring middle-class jobs. There's just, Harris said, well, I'll give you a break on housing, a tax break on housing. That's not an economic agenda. So I think the populist moment is coming because of the vacuum of ideas and viable candidates on the left. What do you think? You guys have any ideas?
Just one point, I think it's more expensive to be a left-wing populist government than a right-wing populist government.
No question.
You think about what a left-wing populist things are offering, they're offering things like universal healthcare, they're offering things like expansion of welfare system. In the UK, it's all about the pressure on the very much not left-wing populist Starmer government is why aren't you reversing restrictions on welfare to families with more than 2 children or winter fuel payments, pensioners, etc., etc. So left-wing populists are going to be seen to have broken their promises earlier because they just can't be expensive of doing all that thing, or they're going to run up deficits and debt even further, where it's somewhat cheaper to say we're going to threaten to round up everyone.
Yeah,
and even I say I'm not downplaying the impact of war power, but doing it is cheap.
That's
the
right.
Long-term impact is very expensive.
No question, and this is why conservative governments always run up deficits. They don't actually follow their own principles. They never follow their own principles and cut down on spending.
I think that's why it's easier to design policy as a right.
No question.
But it is the left-wing policy. It's the left-wing policy.
And the left-wing politics, including Corbyn, and going back to Reagan and Thatcher, they created a veneer that government was the problem and that we have these welfare queens that are wasting government money. It was completely false, but the left never fought back on that narrative. And so that narrative still has a sticking power that government always wastes money. These are these same corporations that don't pay taxes, that use our roads, that use our education systems, that use the US trade representative to argue on their behalf, but they pay zero taxes. Right. So there's an obvious hypocrisy going on, and they're able to get away with it because the left hasn't offered an alternative. Yeah.
Just kind of was reminding me a little while ago, I was reading some book that was talking about basically just like austerity and the impacts of it, and the fact that, long run costs of austerity in terms of like backing up the massive instability, long-term health issues, intergenerational, yada, yada, yada. You can collapse an economy very easily by pulling out any kind of support for that. And the moment that you have an inherited government that needs to come in and spend anything on that, immediately any kind of left-wing populist, you compound those costs in the long run, especially if you have a run of kind of right-wing populists that constantly just keep slashing everything. And so you end up in a position where, that question of, okay, something, if you don't enter with the policy of let's slow it down, let's balance the budget, let's take out the economy, let's whatever that is. And the effects of that end up having those long-term things. If they get kicked out of government and then the next one comes in, those things don't present anything. They present an 8, 10, whatever. And so you end up not only with those inherited things, but spending debts and et cetera, et cetera. And I guess, is there any way of stopping the spiral? How do you address that? If there's so many inherited problems and your policy is going to be, okay, well, let's spend more money. how do you sell that?
I think you're right. I think the timing issue is really big because government investments pay off over the long term. You know, you invest in improving the social welfare state, and education has a very long-term payoff. You know, healthcare benefits have a very long-term payoff, and they're not that visible. You know, it's much easier to create an infrastructure project. Even that might take you 5 or 10 years. So I think you're right. It's a big timing problem, and it's a problem of trying to disavow this idea that government intervention is always bad. Like, I know you might not agree with me completely, Niels, but I believe that the quality of life in Scandinavia is much better than it is in North America because you have a more extensive social welfare state. I met a guy from France just last week at a professor's meeting. He's like, I'm really hoping to get a job back in France because I don't have to worry about healthcare benefits. He has extensive healthcare benefits. I don't have to worry about childcare. I don't have to worry about, long-term unemployment. Even though I might pay at a very high rate, 80 or 90%, I'm happy to do that because I have a much less stressful life. But somehow that message doesn't seem to translate. And you look at economic growth rates, Scandinavian countries, partly because of Novo Nordisk, this weight loss drug that they found. They're sitting on they're doing really well in terms of income. So to have a more extensive social welfare state doesn't mean you have to sacrifice growth. Now, obviously, they're pretty xenophobic too, but there are things we can learn from them. Yeah. Go ahead, Matthew.
One, just in that comment, I wonder if there's some impact on the because if you don't so state that, you would feel less fearful and then maybe less triggered to the wall right wing pocket. My broader question was it seems like there's a working class illiteracy, maybe apart from Bernie Sanders, but I'm fortunate enough to be a professional in the STEM, whatever, and most of the people I hung out with probably couldn't manage a conversation of Tim Hortons. Starbucks, maybe, fancier coffee shop. But I wonder if that's one weakness of expertise layer, where Trump, for all of his background, somehow connects with the guy at Dunkin' Donuts in a way that Kamala couldn't, Joe Biden probably couldn't. There seems to be some illiteracy somewhere. Just
no question about it, right? It's so funny that a billionaire is the one who actually pointed that out, but obviously speaking in plain language and understand and explaining and understanding the economic stress. They talk about deaths of despair. Suicide rates have spiked among white males, especially in the middle age. Obviously, clearly linked to loss of mining and blue collar jobs. And nobody in the Democratic Party is speaking to these things. And you're right. I think it's because they have different life experiences. They don't come from the working class, and so they can't connect with the voters. Ed, something else?
I'm not especially familiar with campaigns, but just never looked into it. Is it especially common for a party to look at like a previous administration and go, hey, this was big policy things that we've done previously. These are big changes that we've done. These are the set up long-term effects or whatever. We can continue those programs, stuff like that. Because I don't think I've really heard about that. And I understand, electoral strategy is complicated and there's very few things that are definite within it. But I guess I'm not sure if there's any kind of general wisdom on that kind of approach.
Troy, you want to try to that one?
Yeah, I think that I'm from the US. I teach at Western Washington University. Sorry. I think in this particular election, the late timing switch meant that they didn't have a campaign that effectively address that. And I think the shaming part of your comments that I did here is consistent with what a lot of stuff that I'm hearing, including a podcast on Code Switch today about the shaming part of identity politics that have really hurt this campaign and the Democrats in general. But I think we were at that political science conference and that reward punishment kind of model of electoral politics as well, where voters were punishing the Biden administration and Kamala for not recovering the economy too. There, most presidencies can't do that. And then I think you're also absolutely right about Democrats. The mainstream Democrats are not connecting with the white working class voters in the United States. The only place in the US that didn't go more conservative was Washington State until they counted all the votes and it actually slightly towards Trump, except when you look at it regionally, if you look around. So you look at the tech economy of Seattle, Bellevue, and the in-migration, 81% of population growth in Washington State 2020, 2024 was in-migration, mostly probably California voters with the wealth to buy new property in Washington and have a comfortable life and or retirement. And those are all really voters that went for Kamala more strongly than for Biden in 2020. It's that population shift. And so I think even smart voters, the illiteracy comment I think is interesting, but even smart voters aren't paying as much attention to everything that we pay attention to. And I think that's a different kind of retail politics that they just couldn't pull off short window.
So remember, there are three things going on. The first is the election. So there you have to have natural talent where the candidate can actually connect with the voters on a retail level as well as on a mass media level. The second one is getting enough lobbyists to fund your campaign. So you have to make all your deals with all the industry groups there, promising them, what contracts they're going to get and how you're going to save their industry. And then the third thing is the inside the Washington conversation, which is the thing you're talking about, which is what policies are the best policies. And we tend to follow that third one, but most people aren't following the third one. But that third one is important because it does inform the policies that the next administration will take. It informs the debates within the campaign, and it also recognize that there's continuity within the civil service. I gave you the example of the tariffs that were continued under Biden against China that will probably be ramped up by Trump. There is continuity across administrations. Some ideas are sticky. And so that third conversation is important, but we shouldn't mistake it for, as Carville said, the only thing that's important is winning. In the end, you can't do anything if you don't win. Alex, do you have any comments or anything you want to share?
Yeah, a couple of things. First of all, Andy, I'd like to thank you for this. It's very informative and a great session. So thank you very much for that. I do have a couple of questions actually, and it's so informative. But first of all, I suppose my major question comes from sort of classifying the U.S. political economy as kind of a plutocracy. So I'm thinking of Citizens United and so forth. I mean, if the right took 30 years to get rid of Wade versus Roe, what about Citizens United? It's huge crippling to American democracy, I think. A second thing that really hits me about this sort of the trends you've identified. I've been giving some thought to that recently as well, but it seems to me that one of the trends is a subsidization of investment. That states now are paying companies substantive money in terms of direct tax rates or subsidies to invest in them. So it's a losing proposition in a certain way, where capital makes an awful lot of cash out of this. So there's that. And the last thing I wanted to mention about Trump, I don't know if it goes elsewhere, but it seems like it's a real plutocracy. Man, think of Elon Musk, and he's going to be the minister of everything. I mean, one of the wealthiest people in the world. He's just sitting by the seat of power. It's very interesting and very indicative of the sort of things that could occur in the future. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Yeah, those are really important points. Thomas?
Democrats rely on putting forward fact-based arguments when it seems that Trump's approach is more to summarize like sentiments and feelings and kind of
Yes.
facts and analysis based on economic data. Can the Democrats afford going into the midterms and the 2028 election to still rely on the same approach, or do they have to kind of change and maybe fight Trump or whoever's going from next from the Republican Party on the same way?
I totally agree with you. This is the biggest disagreement I have with mainstream political science. We don't have a theory of emotions or sentiments. And sentiments, especially in a crisis period, those are the things that determine an election. And unless a candidate has a natural talent to tap into it viscerally, they're not going to connect with the voters. Obama's platform, it was very mainstream and very conservative, and he was certainly in bed with tons of lobbyists. But he hit an emotional chord. And hope and change always sells as long as it's a convincing message, right? People always vote for change, regardless of what happened under Trump. It's just mind-boggling to me. Like, you think about what happened in 2020 and how bad the economy was under the pandemic. And here's a guy telling you to shoot bleach in your veins, and you're going to reelect this guy to run your economy. But people forget, right? And so that's why, because of the myopic kind of nature of voting, you're right, the emotional chord is the most important thing. And therefore, the natural talent that a candidate has, regardless of how smart or, how policy savvy they are, that's the most important thing that they bring to the table. And Harris didn't have it, right? Harris didn't have it. I think there are a couple things on the chat. I might just go through these for a moment. Renewable energy will not stop. Yeah, Texas is the #1 state. Okay. That person thinks that the working class is interested in stock markets. And yeah, David, your point about the deficit is really important, and that gets back to Claire's earlier point, which is because of the conservative governments continuing to run up deficits and the inability to raise taxes from companies, makes it creating a welfare state even more fraught. And now you have this debt overhang from the pandemic and going back to the 2008, financial crisis. So now you're going to say, well, we're going to raise taxes. That's not usually a winning formula. But if you could raise taxes on companies, that should be. Of course, Trump will never do it, even though he says that he's anti-swamp. All of his policies are actually pro-swamp because he knows that's where the money is and that's where the lobbying power is. So it's very interesting. It takes a very rare talent to pull off the level of skill that he has to convince the working class as a billionaire that he's on their side while he's doing everything that's actually hurting them, including repealing their health care, including creating inflation through tariffs, including running up the biggest deficit in history. This is an incredible political talent, right? To be able to pull off that level of hypocrisy. There's a point here about Trump's tariffs. Yeah, there's no question that Canada is on the firing line because they're an easy target. So we should expect our dependence on the U.S. economy to rear its head again. I know that there's some attempt to try to coordinate with Mexico, but it's never really happened. So unfortunately, I think we'll be paying higher prices here. Daphne, something else?
And I do think that's lacking a lot in it, but also I think often enough, like, we want to address the issues that that voters seem to be concerned with. But it seems to me that some of the issues they're concerned with, they have been given. So you see, like, immigration being very high up there. Economy is always very high up, but inflation itself has stabilized. So for people, like, if this fall to be talking about inflation as the
Right.
#1 issue, that seems to me not to take away from it. Like, I am also paying more money at the grocery store than I want to, but it does feel like that narrative that they have honed it in and they're hammering it home
Yeah.
day and night. And then when I'm asked as a voter, what do I care about? I will be, yeah, my immigration seems to be super important. Trans people in sports, that seems to be important to me. If I wasn't consuming those narratives day and night,
Yeah.
I would have never thought about trans women in sports. So
Yeah.
is that's kind of like what I think is lacking from the other side, and it feels like Democrats play defense.
Yeah.
Don't even play defense well. And I'm not sure they have a message that is actually like in the offense, like these are our values, this is where we stand.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. Like, how hard would it have been for Harris to say, you know, she said, well, we would have passed a Republican bill. How hard would it have how hard would it have been for her to say, I'm against illegal immigration. I'm going to hire more amnesty judges and I'm going to enforce our laws. I mean, she was an AG, right? How could she not say, I'm going to enforce our immigration laws? But she didn't want to take that stance, right? Because exactly what you're saying, like I don't know if they're worried about their base or if they simply don't have an idea of what they're for as opposed to what they're against. Maybe a little bit of both.
Just on the topic of inflation, I know that mathematically year-over-year inflation is quite manageable, but I would imagine most people are pinning they're anchoring their impression from like pre-pandemic or something. Because you did have a big surge of inflation and stuff, but if I was in an economically precarious position, I'd be like, damn, these groceries, whatever, cost more than my anchoring point,
Right.
which isn't actually year-over-year, but it's like 5 years. So, like saying, I have journalist friends who are like, yeah, inflation's low, but it's like, you're now invalidating the other person. Oh, ha, 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 you silly person. Inflation it's like the pain of higher prices is there, even though it's not mathematically the same as year-over-year inflation.
Yeah.
There's an unhelpful disconnect with the rest of that.
There's a disconnect between the economics profession and real life, both emotions, speculation in terms of stock market rises and financial instruments. And there's a lag time, right? There's a lag time for the IRA investments to pay off. There's a lag time for the CHIPS jobs to appear. And there's certainly a lag time before people see that decline in inflation that you were talking about and they actually inculcate it. But to me, the biggest problem is housing, right? And housing, it's not just Vancouver. Housing is a problem everywhere around the West. And I think it's because of the financialization of the sector. I think it's because the finance says because of the stock market kind of volatility, we're going to diversify our portfolios and we're going to start trading housing and real estate. And it's obviously the huge kind of conduit for offshore finance that's fleeing China and other places. And so there's all kinds of finance going into housing that's inflating its prices and reducing its scarcity. Eventually, maybe supply will catch up, but who knows how long that'll take. And the supply that's coming is at such a high price that it's not going to benefit most people. And so Harris's response of giving, an $8,000 tax credit, it's like doesn't come close to actually addressing the problem.
I have a question in connection to foreign policy. So if you want, I can sort of stand behind and wait for you to.
No, go ahead.
So Russian here, right? Don't really understand the way American politics works. It looks like a huge wrestling game, right? The gamification of it all is mesmerizing sometimes. But then again, I come from a country that has no politics, so it's the way it should be. I don't know. So in connection to the Ukrainian issue, you mentioned that he probably is going to stop the war. I'm wondering if that really is the case, to what extent, because initially when the Ukrainian war started, every member of Congress, it was a bipartisan issue. All of them stood up and pledged allegiance to the cause for saving Ukrainians, right? And they talked big. We know a lot of things didn't really happen the way they should have. At least I'm sure Ukrainians had a lot of opinions on that issue. Currently, he's saying that he will stop the war, but I'm wondering, is the Republican Party going to stand behind that decision? Are they going to be is there any sort of resistance inside the party that might be happening? Because I know Democrats will not be able to hold them off. It seems unrealistic, at least based on what I understand about the US policy, internal domestic policy. But would there be Republicans who would say, hey, wait a minute, we need to sort of do something for the Ukrainians, we made all these promises? Is that going to happen?
Well, what we've seen time and again is that the mainstream Republican Party will kowtow to Trump when push comes to shove. They have no backbone. Just look at someone like Lindsey Graham or look at even J.D. Vance. who, claimed that Trump was a danger to democracy. These guys will all back down to Trump. But I think my prediction is more based on the exhaustion of Ukraine and Russia. And in the end, it's those two parties that will decide, not Trump, but what Trump
There
decides.
is
Mhm.
in anticipation of the fact that Trump is going to force them to a negotiation. Each one of them tries to grab as much land as they can before
Right.
they are forced to negotiate so that they have a better hand.
Yeah.
But I'm just wondering if at some point this expectation, that's the presumption from the other side, from the outside. I wonder if something inside the United States, I don't know, the generals, the military industrial complex that we keep talking about, something that might put a stop to his attempts. Or is the entire, because we are being told, we keep being told that the US policymaking is not one man's decision-making process. So if one man decided to do that, that doesn't really mean the US is going to go ahead and do it. But so I'm wondering if.
Right, but remember, all of that military aid depends on congressional allocations. And the Republicans control both houses and they control the presidency. And Trump doesn't see a value in continuing the war. And it was already close as it was for the Democrats to get that stuff through. That's why Biden's rushing as much material as he can now. So the only solution is for Europe to step up, and Europe doesn't seem to be willing or able to do that. So I think Ukraine's back is against the wall, and Putin knows that. And that's why Putin's ramping things up so that he can improve his negotiating posture. I don't think Putin can win. I don't know about you. I don't think he can win. But he can certainly claim at least that 20% of the territory that he controls now, right?
I think also the Democrats, they focus too much of their messaging on traditional media and relying on traditional media and completely fail to take into consideration the rise of right-wing podcasts.
No question.
Yeah, if you look at what the top podcasts are right now, like Joe Rogan and others, and when they had opportunities to reach out to those and had been invited to be on those shows, they completely failed to take opportunity.
Yeah, and that gets back to Tomos's and Daphne's points, which is if you want to connect with the audience, you need 30-second takeaway points. And the Democrats never really had any clear takeaway points. I think we should end it now because they're taking away our reception food. So thanks so much.